The DJ lowered the volume, and its hi-ho silver lining blared in unison by 117 18-year-olds filling the hall, merry on punch and memories of the past 5 years of senior school. Debbie tried to make her way over to smiling Colin Cropper. He looked happy with his effort to organise such a do, a time to say goodbye as he realised he was really joining the armed forces, no doubt leaving his youth behind on the sticky hall floor. Shouting something over the music, Sonia grabbed her by the arm, but it was pointless. Debbie couldn't hear a word. As she approached Colin, she felt a sadness rush over her. Maybe it was the punch, or perhaps just the realisation that nothing would be the same again. "I have to go," she shouted. He leaned forward so she could repeat the sentence directly into his ear. The soft, fair hair on her arms swayed to the closeness of his body. "I have to go," she repeated. He was wearing a cross earring in his right ear, and his white Fred Perry polo top made his skin look darker than it was. Ever since the night he instructed her to brush her hand over his skinhead and feel how spiky it was, Debbie had had a secret crush on him, but nobody would ever know. His face was still childlike, always wearing a huge cheeky grin, and she worried about him joining the forces and losing the glow of innocence, or more likely naivety. "Okay, give me a second, I'll give you a lift," he shouted back, smiling and putting a thumb up. "Don't be daft, Colin, it's your party. I've called a cab." "If you're sure, have you said goodbye to Mark?" "No." "Thanks for inviting me." "Don't go," Sonia interrupted. "The party's still on for another 3 hours. He's got an extension for the hall." "You know I have to," Debbie told her, "but I'll phone you tomorrow." "You can't. Phone's been cut off again," Sonia replied. "What?" Debbie shouted back as the pretenders told the hall they were special. Everyone was special, and they screamed the lyrics as loud as their lungs would allow. "Come outside," Sonia told her. It was a chilly night with the beginnings of a rolling mist and a dampness in the air. Debbie was glad she had worn her sheepskin, although this was her favourite time of year. Autumn had a feeling of hope, the leaves making way for new beginnings as they lay crisp on the ground, reflected in twinkling frosty puddles. "Don't go," Sonia requested again. "We're probably not even going to see half the people in there again." "Do you really care?" Debbie asked, taking out 2 low-tar cigarettes, lighting one and handing the other to her best friend. "Nah, not really," smiled Sonia. "But it's a good party. I know you'll miss Colin." "I'll ring you tomorrow, and we can go shopping at the weekend," she replied, ignoring the last remark. "I'm babysitting for the Baileys on Friday, and they owe me for the last 2 weeks. My mum didn't pay the bill, so the phone's been cut off." She took a puff of the cigarette and blew a smoke ring. "But we can meet by the Wimpy Bar in Whitney on Saturday at 10 if you like." "Okay." Debbie saw the cab lights in the distance. The hall was in a strange little alcove off a country lane opposite Whitney Station, almost hidden from view if you didn't know it was there. "Cab's here. Go inside, it's freezing. See you Saturday." Sonia hugged her, stomped the cigarette out and blew tipsy kisses to her friend as she swayed back into the hall. She didn't live in Avis. If she did, there was no doubt she would have left with Debbie, but there was no point. It wasn't the best time to bring friends home. Debbie could see the lights of the car in the distance. She took a deep inhalation of the nicotine. The cold from the evening felt rough on her chest. She would probably be late home. Her mother would be awake calling for her, accusing her of not caring enough to stay by her bedside. She had convincingly argued with herself. She was young. She needed to leave the house for fun from time to time. This party meant more to her than she had let on. She was sad Colin was leaving. She knew she would most likely never see him again. Everything was changing and she wasn't ready. This evening she had planned to let herself get tipsy and then confess her love. No, her lust. Maybe a bit of both for Colin. She heard her name called from the distance. If she didn't know better, she would have sworn it was her mother's voice. She quickly dropped the cigarette and stamped it out, then blew her breath onto her hand, hoping she didn't smell like tobacco. She had left her mother lying in bed in the midst of a long bout of depression. Usually, when it was this bad, she would stay in bed for at least a fortnight. It had only been a few days. Earlier that evening, Debbie had fed her, washed her, and put her in bed in a fresh nightdress and clean sheets. She waited for her to go to sleep before she put on her rah-rah skirt and Minnie Mouse baggy white t-shirt. She had quickly applied her red rouge, highlighting her high cheekbones, and took the advice of her Just 17 magazine, dabbing a little on her eyelids. She slipped her red leather pointy-toe kitten heels on, and then she was free, breathing in the cold air and feeling the exhilaration she needed to feed her youthful vivacity. "Debbie!" the voice called again, but this time in a teasing, malicious tone, with the Deb stressed in a strange rhythmic way. It was coming from the side of the hall. Debbie nervously walked around the wooden hut, trying to build up some saliva in her mouth that would disguise evidence of a cigarette. But it couldn't be her mother. She knew she was being ridiculous, but it sounded so much like her. As realistically expected, nobody was there. There was a huge drop behind the hall, filled with a forest of trees too dense for anyone to be walking. It must be the punch playing with her mind. She was sure Mark Bailey had tipped another bottle of vodka in when nobody was looking. Not that anyone would have complained. After all, they were there to get slaughtered. She walked back to the front of the hall, just in time to see the young couple closing the door of the cab. Her cab, and it quickly drove off in the opposite direction to her home. "Shit!" she shouted into the air. "Shit! Shit! Shit!" She looked at the door of the hall, could hear the DJ mumbling some inaudible words as "oops upside your head" demanded bums on the floor. What was the point in going back in? Sonia would see her and try to make her stay again, and phoning another cab was pointless. Why was it always her who had to leave before everyone else? If she could have stayed until the end, she could have taken a ride with Colin and Mark, spent a few more precious moments with Colin, but nobody else is leaving until 2. She smiled to herself, realising how she had actually allowed herself to fall for Colin. There weren't many good-looking boys in Avis. There wasn't a lot of choice. There was no other option. She would have to walk. It wasn't that far. Fair enough. There being no pavement along the winding country road was a bit of a risk, but there shouldn't be any cars going in the direction of Avis at this time of night. She lit another cigarette. The decision had been made. The country road was darker than she had expected. For a short time she could hear the DJ, his voice booming like a master of a fairground with agreeable cheers as Uptown Girl began to play. Each step moved her away from the fading jeering until it was quiet, apart from the fine rain falling on the leaves. She would be happy once she had passed the dead rats, but that was still a long walk ahead of her. The very thought of the dead rats made her feel as though her throat was closing, with her breath feeling thick and solid. She didn't want to admit to herself she felt frightened. However, she did look back in the direction of the hall, wondering if it was a better idea to go back. Wait for a lift home, even if it did mean getting in past 2. No, keep going. The hall was far enough away now to make no sense in returning. She kept to the right side of the road. Better to be facing any oncoming traffic. Who was she kidding? There would be no traffic. Somehow, the forest on the left looked darker, more menacing. The trees to her right looked brighter, like they were a beam of torchlight shining through the branches. She fastened her stride, glancing through the gaps of the trees as the rain started to get heavier. The darkness weaved in and out of the forest with brief flickers of the strange brightness. She thought she heard laughter, like a child's voice, dampened, then smothered by the heavy fall. She looked harder into the trees and was sure she could see vines moving and twisting around the trunks, but told herself she saw nothing but the sharp, pointy branches. She quickened her pace. She heard her name called again. It was her mother's voice. She wished it was her. To see her familiar face would be so welcome, even if it looked beaten and tired and sick of living. Sunken eyes no longer bothering to plead for help. No more angry spats of jealousy, just miserable and broken. For a moment, Debbie wondered if her mother would come back from it this time. That's when she saw it. A small, pale hand softly placed around one of the trunks. She wanted to run, but for some reason she had stopped and was staring at the tree, trapped by her own fear which held on to inquisitiveness at its own peril. All she could do was back away towards the other side of the road, still staring at the hand. The rain fell harder. She heard the laughing again. Not a sinister laugh, but a playful kind of giggle. There were more voices than just one. She could see her luminous white curls leaning forward from behind the tree, a head bowed, but slowly rising, and then a small devilish little face with a long pinched chin. She was frozen, shivering uncontrollably, not sure if it was the October night air or the fear racing down her spine. The eyes opened, and the urgent glow was extraordinary. Debbie tried to call out, but her voice was broken and she was dragged into the orb, witnessing a nightmare deep inside the hellish optic globe. A twisting, helpless prey tied to a stake, shrieking in agony as its pitiful body burned away into nothingness. Charred embers danced before its blistering eyes. Debbie could feel a torrid heat scorching into her face. She put a hand up to shield her own eyes, closing them tightly, but still they burned. A force behind the beam was pushing her back and the blood in her head was boiling. She didn't think she could stand the intensity of the greedy flames any longer. She was sure she would turn to cinders, but then it stopped, as immediate as it had started, followed by the coolness of the rain. No steam, just rain, as though there were never a beam, never were the searing of pitiful souls. She put her hand down and opened her eyes, frightened of what she might see. In the distance she could see the sinister childlike figure weaving in and out of the trees in an uncanny, unnatural way, faster than humanly possible, followed by two similar beings, one like a dark shadow and the other like a flame, cackling like crows as they vanished. She felt exhausted. Her throat was sore and her legs cold and aching. She wished she could curl up and go to sleep, but she knew such passive action would surely be her doom. Just the thought of her fate in the forest was terrifying. She needed to get home. The music came from nowhere. A 60s tune playing from the Fiat stereo quietly, but certainly loud enough to be heard in the forest. A car. Thank goodness, a lift past the dead rats would be perfect. The car slowed down as it approached her, too far out to the right she thought, but she was grateful for the gap. It rolled to a halt and the music stopped. She was about to approach the driver as he wound down the window, but then she remembered who owned such a car. A foul, dreadful smell shockingly escaped into the cold air to immediately pollute the freshness of the night. The man leaned his bare elbow out of the window and his face followed. His long black hair looked wet. Perhaps he had been out in the rain, or more likely it was grease. He smiled, giving away a missing tooth, the rest of his teeth tobacco-stained, though the car's light was dull, so possibly deceptive. He was wearing a grey baggy t-shirt and looked thin yet strong. "Here, kitty, kitty," he said. A woman leaned forward in the passenger seat and Debbie felt nauseous. "What are you doing out here, Tulip?" she asked. "She's come from that party, haven't you, kitty?" the man answered for her. "I have to get home," Debbie said. The woman spoke. "You're Viv's girl, aren't you? How's she doing?" She smiled. "Get in, Tulip, and we'll take you home." The man leaned his face out of the window and spat on the floor. "No, thanks anyway. I'm happy to walk," Debbie told them, beginning to walk away in the direction of home. The forest terrified her, but there was no way she was getting into their car. "The rain will make your sheepskin go hard, Tulip," the woman said. Debbie heard the man mumble something to his passenger. and the passenger answered in an irritated tone. "Leave it to me. You always scare them off." The car crawled alongside Debbie. The man dropped his hand out of the window. His arm was masculine, black hairs partially covering a faded tattoo. "Come on, Tulip, get in," the woman continued. "You don't want to get lost out here at this time of the night. We must be somewhere. We haven't got all night to wait for you. We don't want to leave you all alone. You don't know who you might meet." The man laughed sardonically. "No, I don't want to. Please just go," Debbie insisted. Then mumbling, "You should get out of here too." "Don't make me have to come to get you," the man said, furrowing his black brows. He looked at her bare legs, then proceeded to scan her up and down. He grinned. "You'll catch a chill." "Shut up," the woman jumped in, pushing him back and leaning closer to the window. "You'll frighten the poor girl away." Her tone altered to a friendlier, prettier manner. "Your mum would want you to take the lift, Tulip. Avis isn't safe for a young girl to be walking alone." "Watch your mouth, woman," the man sneered, pushing her back over to her side of the car. "I've had enough of you talking to me like shit. I'm tired of being your lackey." The car stopped and Debbie walked faster. She could hear the couple arguing behind her, the sound of a slap, the man's voice deep in protest as the woman cackled her disappointment. The rain fell harder. She needed to hurry before they were with her again, insisting she got in the car. She was too frightened to get off the road, in case the children were waiting, hiding behind the trees ready to consume her. Her terrifying thoughts were broken with the familiar sound of snapping, as though a juggernaut force was destroying the forest. She turned, petrified, to glimpse into the abyss. She was physically pushed back, her neck craning as a huge black shadow devoured the sky, darker than the blackness that spat the rain, the moon vanishing behind the enormous mass. The downpour unnervingly halted, and the unexpected stillness was unbearable. "What the fuck is that?" the man barked. "Drive," the woman ordered. "Just drive, Freddie." "I can't, the engine's dead." Debbie had no choice but to make a quick dart into the forest. However, it saw her, and she was brutally pushed against a tree by its force, pinned to its trunks. But with eyes tightly closed, she held on. She heard the woman hollering orders at the man and the sound of wheels screeching. There was a brief pause, a silence, to then be broken by the keys in the car trying to start the engine again. It didn't last longer than a few seconds before the grinding of wheels and caterwauling started again. The noise slowly weakened with the expanding distance between herself and the car. She couldn't move until she was sure all the players of the nightmare had disappeared. The sound of the heavy rain, imitating a rushing brook, hurried in the direction of Avis. She kept still, hoping she was hidden by the forest. Tears merged with the rain gushing down her face. After what must have been an hour, the concern of returning home late to her mother dominated over her timidity. She opened her eyes and saw the night was as it should be, dark, cold and wet. She felt unsteady on her feet as she left the forest and was on the road again, stumbling in the stream of rain. She quickened her stride, but with fear the couple would be parked farther down the road. She didn't allow herself to think about the entity in the forest or what the couple had planned to do to her. She was getting closer to the dead rats, an unwelcome view, but once she was past it, she would be home and dry. She was sure her sheepskin was ruined.